Uber. Sure, it's more convenient than a cab.
I can't believe they locked me up for driving on a sidewalk.
But you know what a cab doesn't have? Surge pricing. That means when it's harder to get an Uber, like at rush hour or on Christmas Day, you end up paying more because the demand is higher. I mean, it feels kind of manipulative, like you can't really help if you have to go someplace at the same time as everybody else. That's because even though millions of people use Uber every day, it actually rests on a very delicate ecosystem. The supply of riders and drivers must be balanced.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
And in the past, Uber has done some kind of manipulative things to ensure that that balance is achieved. For example, they've used psychology and behavioral science to keep drivers driving longer than they should. Let me explain. Uber really has two customers: the rider, so the person in the car, and the driver who needs to get the rider somewhere. But how can Uber drivers be Uber's customers? Well, it's simple. Uber needs to convince people to drive for them instead of doing some other job, and so they have to market to them just like they would market to a customer. And like we said earlier, if there's too many or too few riders or drivers, the whole ecosystem breaks down. Uber needs drivers to drive as long as possible, so Uber can get paid for rides as long as possible. You see where I'm going with this, but there's no magic button that Uber can push to keep drivers on the road. So they have to use some psychology and behavioral science, not always in the most ethical way. In 2017, the New York Times ran an expose about the ways Uber used psychology to keep drivers driving. They interviewed dozens of current and former Uber officials, drivers, and social scientists, and came to the conclusion that Uber was using behavioral science to undermine its drivers' well-being. According to the article, while giving lip service to treating its drivers with more dignity and fairness, it also, quote, engaged in an extraordinary behind-the-scenes experiment in behavioral science to manipulate them in the service of its corporate growth. The first thing that the New York Times dug up was Uber's use of concrete financial goals to motivate its drivers to stay online. To understand how Uber was doing this, the New York Times spoke to Josh Streeter, a former Uber driver in Florida. He showed them some of the messages he got on his driver's app when he tried to log off and quit driving for the night. The first message said, "Make it to $330. Then another message, "You're $10 away from making $330 in net earnings. Are you sure you want to go offline?" Below this message, there were two choices: go offline or keep driving. Keep driving was highlighted so people would notice it and click it, but go offline was not. To understand why this is so tricky, we need to back up for a second and talk about how our subconscious minds make choices for us. The messages that Josh got on his phone play on two powerful psychological principles. First is loss aversion. This says that people hate losing something much more than they like gaining something. In fact, we hate to lose so much that the psychological pain of losing is twice as powerful as the happiness and excitement of getting the same thing. Loss aversion is one of the most powerful behavioral drivers that we have as human beings. Second is something called the goal gradient effect, that says we're much more motivated by how much we have left to go before we hit a goal. In this case, the arbitrary $330 earning goal that Uber selected and suggested for this driver. Goal gradient in this case is supercharged by an effect called income targeting. It says when workers who can decide how long they want to work each day, and therefore how much they might earn, they often start their day with a financial goal in mind to motivate themselves. An internal Uber study even found that many new drivers practice, quote, an extreme form of income targeting. But as drivers got more experience on the platform, they also found that income targeting behavior was inefficient because they'd have to work extremely long shifts on slow days and then get off early when they were busy. In other words, by creating these arbitrary income goals to keep drivers driving, Uber was asking them to do something that experience would show was not actually in their best interest. In fact, the only person whose interest it was in was Uber. Uber's drivers tend to be lone wolves. There's no office where they can go and bump into colleagues and chat. Instead, their only point of contact with the company is the app. In its pursuit of keeping drivers engaged as long as possible, the company used common gamification elements like badging to motivate and reward its users. And that sounds fine until you begin to consider the bigger picture. In most markets, Uber drivers are independent contractors who have to pay for fuel, insurance, car maintenance, and other associated costs. Drivers can very easily lose money when working with Uber. Scott Weber, an Uber and Lyft driver, told the New York Times that he drove full-time, and in the year prior to his interview reported less than $20,000 in income before expenses. He told the paper, quote, "I was a business that had a loss. I'm using payday loans." These types of gig economy workers don't have unions to advocate on their behalf, and they can go weeks, months, or even forever before comparing their reality to what other drivers experience. So in this context, keeping people driving, which was not always in their financial interests, and rewarding them with digital badges instead of money, in a closed context where they didn't have many ways to increase or even understand their income, isn't helping to improve drivers' welfare and earning potential. To some of you, Uber's nudging might seem like fair play.
Hey, Trotsky, you're in advertising.
Sure, Uber was applying behavioral science in some sneaky ways, but they never forced anybody to drive for them. But because in all markets at the time, Uber's drivers were considered contractors, none of these behavioral strategies were limited by employment laws. According to Uber, its new CEO has helped Uber undergo a radical culture change to become more ethical and accountable for decisions like these. But even though Uber has changed its ways, it still begs the question, where is the line between manipulation and marketing?